And so the next speaker will be Céline Flory. Céline is a fellow researcher at the CNRS and a member of the Center for Studies and Research on the American Wars, Cerma. And her research focuses on indentured and post-slavery Caribbean, more precisely on the social and cultural trajectory of African, Indian, and Chinese engagés and their descendants. So we are going to do a step behind in the time, going back to the 19th centuries. And her book, De l'esclavage à la liberté forcée, Histoire des travailleurs africains engagés dans la Caraïbe française du 19e siècle, has been granted the FEDCAN Maryse Condé 2015 Research Award. Her talk today is about imperial policies and indentured labor migration in the Caribbean 19th century. So Céline, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank the Convergence Migration Institute, Claire Zalc, and Antonin Durand for their invitation. Today, I'm going to discuss the strategy put in place by the French government to access permanent sources of indentured migrant laborers for French Caribbean. To understand this, let's start by introducing French indentured labor migration. Following the abolition of slavery decreed on April 27, 1848, the French government chose to resort to indentured labor migration, that is, the immigration of workers with indentured contracts lasting several years. According to the term of their contract, concluding before their departure, their transportation costs were covered and they were entitled to repatriation at the end of their contract. During their engagement, their employer had to provide them food, lodging, clothing, care, and a small salary in exchange for their labor force. In the colony, they were subject to extremely restrictive labor laws. It should be noted, and this is one of the fundamental characteristics of this form of work, that the indentured contract is unbreakable. By resorting to this form of labor, the colonial administration and the planters wish to exert downward pressure on the wages of the former slaves and to counter the social and political demands of the latter. In turning to indentured labor migration, the French government is no exception. On the contrary, it follows the British model, which had used it for its colonies since it abolished slavery in 1833. It is then a question for the French government to set up a vast and perennial migration policy. The question for the French government is which countries or regions of the world are likely to provide several thousand workers willing to expatriate themselves for many years to unknown and distant land. This is one slide, the first slide. To answer this question, the French government relied on the example of the British, who recruited mainly in their possessions in India. But from the very first recruitments for the island of Réunion, carried out in 1849 within the 5 French establishments in India, the French authorities noted that the supply of workers was very limited. Under these conditions, recruiters prospected at the risk of illegality in the British territories of the East India Company. Depending on their will, the British authorities lightened or increased border surveillance and police repression. Between 1849 and 1852, the hardening approach prevailed. The action of French recruiters was ended by fines and arrest incidents multiplied. From then on, negotiating with Great Britain was inevitable. In October 1851, the French government asked its British counterpart to officialize recruitment on its territories. But in January 1852, the answer was abrupt, and without appeal, it was no. The directors of the East India Company already had difficulty tolerating recruitments for the British colonies in the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean because they feared that they would take away a precious workforce for their colonial projects in India itself. So, organizing recruitments for the French colonies, they were firmly opposite to it. This answer is far from satisfying the French government, which is preparing to extend the immigration of Indian workers to its Caribbean colonies, in addition to Réunion. Next slide, please. It was then that Théodore Ducos, the French Minister of the Navy and Colonies, considered a new negotiation strategy. Next slide, please. I quote, "I believe that the basis of the negotiation must be changed, that it must be about both India emigration and Africa emigration, so that by bringing these two terms together, an alternative is born that leaves us in the end in control of the part of the field." End of quote. The term African emigration should be understood as African immigration by repurchase of captives. What is it about? It's a method of recruitment that consists of buying, with the authorization of the French government, captive people on the human markets of the African coast, in order to impose on them an indentured contract for several years, a contract on which they are listed as, and I quote, free blacks. The French government implemented this process to bridge the lack of colonial labor in Africa itself, caused by the measure to ban the slave trade, the first in 1815. Shortly after the implementation of this process, strong protests were heard from the British government, which contested the legitimacy of this system, which was similar to the slave trade. Indeed, a virulent controversy opposed France and Great Britain around the captives' repurchase, which I will summarize briefly. The question that deeply opposed these two governments was whether buying an individual in captive condition participated in the legally reprehensible slave trade. For its part, the French government considered that buying a man to liberate him from his slave status did not constitute an act that could be assimilated to or participated in the slave trade. On the other hand, the British government considered that buying a man, even if it was to give him back his freedom, was an act that participated in the slave trade. As demand created supply, free men were made captives and horse slaves to be sold to the French. The French government responded to this argument by challenging the idea that captive slaves were free men before. They were born slaves or have been slaves for a long time. The French demands will thus created no violence in Africa. The two governments would never agree. Ducos was well aware of his hostility, and this is why he hoped that the prospect of the French government having recourse to it should push the British government to consider the French request for Indian indentured laborers with more flexibility. And this is all the more so since, next slide please, two decrees defining in particular the modalities of recruitment, transportation and reception in the French colonies had just been issued, thus answering one of the main objections of the British, which was the absence of a French legislation capable of ensuring the interests of the immigrants. In accordance with the prescriptions of Ducos, as you can read on the next slide, please, in May 1852, Turgot sent clear instructions to the French ambassador in London to obtain the right to recruit Indian workers in British territories, and he openly announced the terms of the blackmail. But the expected effect did not happen. The British government remained in its position. Ducos then decided to push further his strategy of trade. On the one hand, the French government authorized the immigration of free status African indentured laborers, and on the other hand, it officially informed the British government of the project to recruit by captive repurchase. In fact, France and Great Britain had been involved together in the repression of the slave trade through a bilateral convention since 1845. In view of Article 4, next slide please, of this convention, it was still too risky politically and diplomatically to put in place. In fact, how could France justify prohibiting them from selling captives on the one hand and buying them on the other? Moreover, the resolution of Great Britain is also explained by the awareness that the French government could do nothing but go to confrontation because of this convention. This was all the more undesirable as the two powers were preparing to confront Russia in the Crimea. It was imperative that they reach an agreement and cooperate. But if the negotiations remained blocked, the political situation evolved. The convention, the principal legal obstacle, expired in 1855, and the Franco-British alliance was reaffirmed at the end of Crimean War. Although aware of the criticism that this would generate, the French government could attempt a confrontation by freeing itself from British assent without taking too many political risks. The French government then authorized recruitment by captive repurchase, and in March 1857, it signed an agreement for the introduction of 20,000 African indentured laborers into the French West Indies. The extent of this agreement shows that more than a simple object of blackmail, the Ministry of the Navy and the Colonies seems to really count on this convention to make up for the deficit of Indian emigration. One thing does not exclude the other, and it forces the impact that such a convention will have sooner or later on the British government and the benefits it will be able to draw from it. British government reaffirmed its hostility as expected and invited the French government to review its migration policy. At the same time, it agreed to resume negotiations on Indian immigration to the French West Indies and Guyana. French strategy worked this time. Between this first opening and the conclusion of a bilateral convention, 4 years passed, during which the negotiations were suspended several times due to international political changes. As Ducos wanted in his time, emigration by captive repurchase was indeed at the heart of the exchange. For both sides, it was an essential means of pressure, although used in opposite ways. On the British side, the government engaged in a diplomatic policy based on two main axes: the relaunching of negotiations for the opening of their territories in India to French recruiters, and the reaffirmation of the fight against the slave trade by trying to demonstrate through facts the analogy of the repurchase with the slave trade. British abolitionists were very mobilized against the French protest and pressured their government to arrest it. On the French side, the political line was quite different. In order to keep its advantage, the French government had to challenge all analogy between repurchase and the slave trade. It could not disavow the repurchase process without implicitly admitting that he had practiced a form of the slave trade. Moreover, to disavow it in the face of British criticisms would put him in a position of inferiority vis-à-vis the British. It therefore had to maintain a balance between two poles, defending the captive repurchase and continuing negotiation to obtain Indian workers. In addition, in order to maintain the pressure, once the negotiations were underway, the French government had to ensure that African immigration by captives repurchase was perceived as operational and sustainable by the British government. Without this, blackmail would remain ineffective. During the 4 years of negotiations, the British government was very conciliatory, agreeing to almost all French objections and proposals. On the other hand, the French government showed rigidity and bad faith. In the posture of the one who asked for nothing, it consciously concealed the fact that it had linked India immigration and African immigration, as well as the real need for it that this negotiation succeed. In fact, although it displayed a certain constancy, the French government was confronted with internal tensions between the Ministry of the Navy and Colonies and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a fervent defender of the Franco-British alliance. However, it bluffed during all the negotiations, showing total confidence in the possible continuation of recruitment by repurchase. In view of the situation of recruitment on the ground and the difficulties it causes, the French government's assurance appears to be an illusion. Indeed, to continue any longer had become almost impossible for practical and political reasons. But in the end, a convention was signed in Paris on July 1, 1861, opening the British territories to French recruitment. To conclude, the French case presented here clearly shows how these indentured labor migrations generated many dealings between empires and within empires themselves. For the latter, the world was transformed into a vast market where each considered where to take labor that was moved from one end of the empire to the other, in order to satisfy their desire for power and enrichment. In order to set up a vast and long-term migration policy towards their post-slavery colonies, France skillfully exploited the known hostility of the Great Britain towards the captives repurchase, and more broadly, its involvement and its stakes in the fight against slave trade. Behind this political calculation, next slide please, from 1853 to 1889, more than 76,000 indentured laborers from India arrived in French West Indies and Guyana. And behind this blackmail, more than 19,200 men, women, and children were bought by the French government to be deported and transformed into indentured laborers. 17,015 of them arrived on the other side of the Atlantic. The other 2,216 died during the Middle Passage. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Céline, for this wonderful presentation. And so again, thank you for those who asked for questions in the chat box, and don't hesitate to continue, and we will answer the questions at the end of the session.